Blacks in technology.
Blacks in technology. Blacks in technology. Blacks in technology. Blacks in technology. Blacks in technology.
And we are back, everyone, for the 54th episode of the Blacks in Technology BitTech Talk podcast. I'm your host this evening, Greg Greenlee, along with my colleague, Ayori Selassie. We missed Ayori last week, so I'm glad that we have her back this week because I was long.
I'm back.
Yeah, it's a different feel when you have to host a podcast by yourself. So I'm glad you're back for this one because this is a good one, a real good one. Not that last week's wasn't, or not last week, but the last podcast. Not that it wasn't good, but I like having my partner.
Cool, awesome. Glad to be here.
Yeah. She has a fantastic brain, and it just helps the flow of the podcast. It helps, especially with questions. She always has great questions. I always have, real cookie cutter questions. She always comes with the questions. I'm like, how did you think of that? That's excellent. So if you're listening to us for the first time, we're at www.blackandtechnology.net. You can find us also on Twitter. We're at Black and Technology. That's BLKINTECHNOLOGY. That's our Twitter. We're on Facebook as well, so facebook.com/Blacks and Technology. We also have a LinkedIn group under Blacks and Technology. And if you want to tweet us questions for our guests during this podcast, tweet us using the hashtag BitTechTalk. BITTECHTALK. I'm sorry. Let's go into what else? Oh, yeah, member count. We're almost up to 1,300 members, everybody. That's excellent. So, round of applause to all of our members, the community, and the networks, everybody who's following and supporting Black Technology. We definitely thank you. Definitely getting more and more Twitter followers, more people joining the LinkedIn group as well. So, thanks everybody for that. And we want to give thanks to our sponsor for the show. That's MongoDB. If you don't know, then check out MongoDB World. It's June 24th and 25th at the Sheraton Times Square in New York. So MongoDB is the database that makes development simple and beautiful. Learn more about it in over 80 sessions. Ask the expert. Appointments, Expo Hall with solution providers and social events. And if you register with the code BIT50, that's BIT50, you get 50% off registration for MongoDB. So that is excellent. We partner with MongoDB for that very reason, so we can provide our community and our network with resources. So if you want to go to MongoDB World, use the registration code BIT50, and you'll get 50% off registration. Also, if you'd like to become a sponsor of one of the Big Tech Talk episodes and get your company in front of our network, email us at sponsorship@blacksandtechnology.net. What else? Oh, if you haven't noticed, Blacks and Technology, we went through a little bit of plastic surgery. So if you're looking for the old site, we've combined BitTech Digest, which is our blog, our technology blog, and the Bit Community, the Blacks and Technology community site, combine them into one. Now it's one fantastic site. All you need is one URL to get to everything, blacksandtechnology.net. You'll see all the blogs. You'll find our podcast. You'll find the community site with the forums and everything. It's all under one URL now, so I hope you like it. It's blacksandtechnology.net. What else? Also, our newsletter. We launched a newsletter. So check that out as well. Hope you were able to receive it, or everybody who's part of the newsletter sign up, the membership sign up, whatever that is. New newsletter, definitely got some things going on there. So check out the newsletter if you can. And what else? Oh, our guest for this evening. Our guest for this evening is going to be Nigel Kersten. Nigel is the CIO and the VP of Operations at Puppets Labs. We're happy to have Nigel on the podcast tonight. We're going to be talking about some fantastic things. So I want to introduce our guest, Nigel. Nigel, thanks for joining us this evening.
Thanks for the invitation.
No problem. Oh, you know what? I forgot. Ayori, did you want to say anything before we get started with Nigel?
Only that this is about to be one of the most exciting bit tech talks we've ever had. So everybody, sit on the edge of your seat because you're going to need to be there.
Yeah, strap in as we continue with Nigel. So Nigel, again, thanks for joining us tonight. So Nigel comes to us from Puppet Labs. Like I said, he is the CIO, the VP of operations at Puppet Labs. So we're going to really dig into his brain about Puppet. We're going to talk a little bit about DevOps. We're going to talk about diversity and technology as well. So I'm going to jump right into these questions right now. And so first question, Nigel. So go back in your mind as far as you can. What was the first thing that got you into technology?
Pretty good question. So I think it was probably as I was a kid, growing up in Malaysia, I think at the time, we called it Meccano. I think in America, what do they call it? Erector sets. Okay. You know, it was sort of like Lego, but it was like little bits of metal, but it had pre-punched holes in it, and you screwed it together, and you could build these crazy things. And I think for me, that was really, you know, I'd played with Lego, I'd played with blocks, but there was something different about Meccano. It was like programming something. And I think really soon after that, I got one of those Radio Shack 50-in-1 science kits, you know, with you had wires and you basically got to wire them up to a bunch of different things. And I made a burglar alarm for my room. So, you know, my mum and dad, they'd open the door, and every time they opened the door, it'd go, rant, 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 and this siren would go off. And that was just about the coolest thing I'd ever done in my entire life up to that point. And I think that, honestly, like that little kit kind of sent me off in a whole direction of, as soon as I found a computer at school, I started wanting to program on it and basically bugged my parents mercilessly until I chipped in half the money from my paper run and they chipped in some money and I started getting computers. And honestly, I'm not sure what I would do with my life if I hadn't sort of discovered tech and computers and programming. It just fit my brain in a way that nothing else I'd done had before that.
Nice.
I love that story. I think that's interesting to think about. Well, what would have happened if your friends had decided to, you know, just get you, you know, army men instead of the Meccano set? you might have become, you know, like the chief military officer instead.
Used by socialist teachers, so that was probably not going to happen.
Do they still have those sets around? What's the substitute for those nowadays?
I reckon it's probably Lego Mindstorm, which honestly I would have just about died and gone to heaven if that had existed when I was a kid. The idea that you could build something physically with Lego and then you could program it on your computer, but we just have such rich stuff for kids these days that's really accessible, you know, like Arduino PCs and all these little wiring kits. And every time, you know, you turn up to a maker fair or anything like that and you see all these little kids building really cool stuff. And it's kind of cheap and accessible. Like, I think there was definitely a period in the 80s and 90s when I was a kid where you had to be kind of rich to afford a computer. And so it sort of left a lot of people out of the story. But now there's so much access. And I think it's not the cost of the technology itself that blocks people anymore. Like we have other kinds of barriers that sort of preclude diversity, but at least we can buy cheap computers for people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What would you say, you know, some of those other barriers might be that are preventing that?
So I think the way we do recruiting in technology is kind of at fault. And I've been thinking a lot about this lately as I've been trying to sort of improve diversity in the funnel of applicants for jobs that we have. But there's this really sort of cookie cutter way a lot of tech companies advertise jobs. It's like, you know, come here, do this sort of role. We expect you to have had 4 years experience doing this exact task. We expect you to have had 7 years experience doing this exact task. And there's just this long sort of list of you must hit all of these points before you're qualified to even apply for the job. And I think if you look at the research people have kind of done about this, like women tend to not apply for a job unless they hit 90 to 100% of all of those items. Whereas a lot of guys, you know, especially, you know, white privileged males applying for a role will do so quite happily when they only hit 30, 40% of the items, because your privilege kind of gives you this confidence to go, well, you know, I can explain why those other things don't quite matter and why I can still be great at the job. So I think it really starts in a lot of ways of how we recruit people. And the tech industry, I think, needs to get much better at focusing on behavioral attributes rather than just a checklist of experience.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, just last night we did a Geek Girl dinner over at Salesforce, and definitely for a lot of the women I sat down and had a chat with, you know, it was that, you know, well, I don't fit this, or I don't have that, or I don't have that. It's like, oh, but you have this. Like, focus on what you do have. And kind of having to encourage them in that area, and just kind of spreading that awareness about how valuable, you know, the bits of information that you do have are, and how to really, just highlight that.
Yeah, totally. And I think, the way we post job ads, and especially the way a lot of large tech companies farm out the filtering of resumes to just the HR person who's not a domain expert. And I love HR people. I think they're one of the most important areas of the company. But they're not necessarily the person who can read a resume and interpret the story someone's told on their cover letter and go, you know, this person might be a really great candidate. They're really just trying to check off, have they worked with Exchange? You know, have they done an SAP deployment? Do they know Ruby or Python? Whereas, you know, the reality is someone who's smart, who has the right kind of mindset and is willing to learn, if you're hiring like a sysadmin with some programming experience, if they know one language, they can kind of pick up the other one pretty quickly. It's a lot harder to teach someone how to have initiative and approach their job in the right way. It's easy to pick up skills.
Yeah, that's a good point. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that we've had a few of these discussions on the forums before, and I think it's real important that this is being said, because I think where some of this comes from is the recruiters out there. Like I've seen quite a few people within a LinkedIn group or within the forums, you know, kind of get dismayed and kind of intimidated by going through the whole employment process, simply because of how recruiters are basically trying to, you know, pick candidates, you know, and they will, recruiters will come at them and say, hey, you need this, and have this long checklist. And it kind of intimidates people. It backs them down and say, okay, well, you know, maybe this job isn't for me. And next thing you know, they when they come across another job and it has another long checklist, they don't even bother to even apply.
Totally. Yeah. It's like we're precluding diversity before we even make the decision about who we hire, and that's just not good enough. But this should be an easy story to sell to tech companies, because even if you're one of those people who doesn't really care about improving diversity, you're going to get better candidates. Like if you focus on good behavioral attributes, you're going to get better people for applying for your jobs. You're not going to get the people who just sort of apply for, well, I fill that checklist. You know, 5 years of experience doing something doesn't matter if you just did the same thing over and over again and didn't learn from any of the mistakes. Whereas someone else could have done the same job for 3 months and be a way better prospect.
Yeah, and I just want to add the piece around just encouraging folks who are in the job market to, you know, be aware of the sort of the framework that a recruiter kind of comes from. You know, human capital is, you know, it's probably the second, if not most important currency in a company, right after the bottom line.
Yep.
And their whole job is to find people who are going to, you know, fit that pattern that they're trying to, match for the hiring managers that they have. And so kind of, you know, interview the recruiters that you talk to. Like, get
Absolutely.
a little bit into their story and what they're looking for, and, you know, just find a way to fit that, find a way to influence that, find a way to give that recruiter the confidence that you are an amazing person to put before anyone, and don't let the checklist be a hindrance to you.
Absolutely. And, you know, recruiters aren't the only way to get jobs. Like, we have a lot of our candidates come through on referrals, and it doesn't mean that you have to adhere to some kind of nepotism and only hire friends of your friends. But good referrals come through networks. Like, you know, turn up to events, network with people, but not in a sort of cynical way, but genuinely talk to people, find out what kind of jobs they have at their company, find out if they're interesting, and you're in a such better place to apply for those jobs once you've actually made contact with someone and understand something about the business that they're doing.
15 minutes in, and we're already in too deep.
But yeah, I don't pretend to have anywhere near sort of all the answers here. This is something, we've been kind of trying to work on here at Puppet Labs, and I know a bunch of people in the tech industry really are trying to improve the situation, but I think having the open conversation, first of all, is the most important thing.
All right,
awesome.
Definitely.
So just moving on to the sort of the next little bits and pieces here, we want to learn a little bit more about you and a little bit about your story. I looked at your LinkedIn profile. I see that you were at Google. You were a system administrator. How did you get to Puppet Labs from Google, and just kind of can you share your story around that?
Sure. So I guess how I got to Google in the first place is probably a pretty sort of interesting story, because it was pretty unintended, I guess, from my point of view. I wasn't a very good college student. Like, I'm just going to come out and say it. Like, uni's a lot cheaper in Australia, so it was a much less expensive mistake to make. But I think it ultimately took me 14 years to finish a degree, because I kept changing my mind about which degree I was doing. And while I was doing this, I was working at the university, and I'd honestly automated an awful lot of my job. And I was working at the uni because it was convenient while I studied, but it also left me a lot of time to, blog and talk to people on mailing lists and sort of try and help other people who are facing similar problems at work, because there was I had to do something with my time when I was sitting at work. And that turned out to be a really good move in a way, because it sort of just boosted my own profile within the Mac sysadmin community. I was doing a lot of Mac OS X administration and sort of large-scale Mac management. And then Google realized they sort of had a problem with their Mac management and sort of reached out to me and asked me to apply for a job. So I was in Australia at the time, and, Google, it was, I think, 2007, Google offered me a job, and so I talked to my wife and we moved the whole family over to the Bay Area. So when I got there, I realized the Mac deployment was a little bit of a mess. There were some really good people there, but it just sort of wasn't very organized. And we were looking around for a config management tool, because a lot of the traditional desktop and laptop management tools didn't really fit Google very well. Google's really flexible with its employees. Most people had admin access on their laptops. You could install software, and they wanted to keep giving people the freedom to that, but still have a secure sort of standardized operating environment. And I turned up to a friend of mine's talk at a guy from Ohio, actually, who I know has spoken fondly about Ohio Linux Fest that we were talking about before the show started, Jeff McCune, and he was doing a talk at an Apple developer conference and showed off Puppet. And I was like, wow, this is totally going to fit for what we need. And so I think that afternoon we had Puppet sort of running on a few boxes. Within a few weeks, we'd sort of rolled it out to a whole bunch of the Macintoshes, and within a month or so, it was like a functional deployment, which we were pretty happy with. So I think we had 7,000 or 8,000 Macs at the time. The Linux team had kind of been struggling with their CF Engine deployment, and they sort of just had this big organic mess that had grown over time, and they were sort of looking around for different options. And so they ended up jumping on board the Puppet train, as did the sort of Solaris folks later. And we ended up sort of merging a bunch of those groups over time until we sort of ran Puppet on a whole bunch of things. So I was involved with the Puppet community pretty early. I think even before Puppet Labs was a company, I knew Luke Knies and a bunch of the other people from the Puppet community. I was writing a bunch of the Mac Puppet code. So I sort of knew all of those people and went along to a Puppet camp that we had in San Francisco, and it was just a really great group of people. It wasn't just that they were all using Puppet. They were all forward-thinking, and they were actually trying to find a better way to do their jobs. It wasn't just people who were satisfied with the status quo. It was everyone sort of pushing the envelope and going, no, seriously, there has to be a way better way of doing this than the traditional sort of sysadmin methods. And so I think after 3.5, 4 years that I was at Google, Puppet Labs, Luke had started the company by then and decided he got another funding round and was like, hey, do you want to come up here? And we were feeling a little bit jaded with the Bay Area and came up and visited Portland, and I really like beer and I really like coffee and I really like, a lot of the stuff that Portland has. My wife's really into thrift stores and tattoos. So, it felt like a city that was pretty much designed for us. And yeah, and so that was really great. I think we were less than 20 people when I joined Puppet Labs, and we're nearly 300 now. So it's been pretty crazy, sort of 3.5 years.
Wow, so Puppet's still a little on the small side then.
Yeah, I'd say we punch above our weight.
No, that's awesome. So, I mean, given the story of, coming from Google, which is just monolith, just huge, right? And solving their, issues of scale at Google, and now going over to Puppet and being in this, a higher level, CIO role. I'm wondering if you can just shed some light on sort of what are the core challenges that large enterprise level companies are facing today relating to scaling their systems. If you can just sort of throw it out there, like what are these top challenges that our listeners really need to be aware of?
Yeah, so I think scale brings with it its own challenges, and I really hadn't sort of had to face any of these until I came to Google. At the university I was running several hundred, I think maybe 100 servers even, and a couple of thousand sort of clients, which really wasn't that big a scale. And then I got to Google, and suddenly it was, I think we ended up being 20,000 Mac laptops by the time we were finished, and there's just hundreds of thousands of servers everywhere. And it just sort of changes your mindset, because if you have a problem that only exhibits itself on 1% of your machines each month, if you've only got 100 servers, that's just one weird server that, it'll send a Nagios alert or something, you go look at it, you fix it, and you reboot it or whatever. But if you've got 100,000 servers, that's suddenly 1,000 different servers that are misbehaving every month. And so it sort of really forces a whole bunch more rigor upon you, because you just can't afford to have error rates that are anywhere near that high. You need way more reliability. You need a different mindset about your servers. Even at the uni, I used to name my servers. I gave them names. I used to love naming them after Japanese monsters. So it was like, Godzilla and Gamera and Mothra and Ghidorah. But when you've got hundreds of thousands of servers, you're not going to name them all. And there's this sort of saying, I think, in the DevOps world that treat your servers like cattle, not like pets. You don't want to name them and feed them and brush their fur and treat them specially. You want them to be much more like cattle on a farm, where you're like, which cow's that? Well, that's cow number 150. So I think,
that's a really interesting analogy.
Yeah, and, not to encourage, unsafe farming practices or anything, but there's things you can do at scale that you don't do with your pets. Like you just treat them fundamentally differently. And so I think that really changed my mindset. And I think also stepping into an organization that is pretty rigorous in terms of operations, the SRE and sysadmin organization at Google, having a whole bunch of peers who really force rigor upon you. You'd be like, hey, we're going to do an upgrade on this thing. And they're like, no, you're not just going to do an upgrade. Like, you're just going to write up something really quickly. It's not going to be a big bureaucratic process, but it's going to be, what's your rollback plan? How long is your rollback going to take? What are you going to do if it all goes south? Who are you going to communicate with? What are you going to say when it's all done? And there's just sort of these little things that I think force a certain amount of rigor upon you. And even just as things as simple as you're writing shell scripts. I turned up at Google and I thought I was pretty damn good at writing bash and shell and T-shell. But suddenly I had a whole bunch of people around me who were super expert, who, some of whom had contributed to various versions of bash over the years, who would, do code review of my scripts and just pull them apart and just go, seriously, set -E and set -U at the top of every single script. You don't want some unset variable causing havoc further down the line, 2 years later when someone who wasn't involved with writing the script has to actually run it. So it's just, I think it's scale forces problems that you had already to come to the fore because you're just having to deal with them. And I think one of the things we've seen sort of out of the DevOps movement and a bunch of the people moving from these big web operations shops like, Yahoo and Google and even Facebook and Apple and a lot of those big Bay Area companies, as they've moved to startups, they've taken a lot of that mentality with them because they're just used to working with fundamentally more reliable systems.
Yeah. I think that's a great segue into this next question, because we talk about scale and we talk about hundreds and thousands of systems. What about let's talk about the opposite end of that? What about tech workers who don't have access to thousands of systems? What advice would you give them as far as skill set to make them more appealing in today's tech ecosystem? And also, how does a company, a company that might not have, how do you kind of sell Puppet and the idea of DevOps and such to a company that doesn't have thousands of servers? Kind of how do you approach that?
Yeah. So I think for the individuals, so looking at that first, like how can people sort of improve their own career prospects? I think honestly, you want to focus on automation. Automation really is the key, because what you can demonstrate, even at a small scale, to your manager is going, there was this thing, it used to take me 2 or 3 days out of my month, each month, and now it's just takes 0 time because I've automated away, it's fully monitored, it runs reliably, and now I can move on to another thing. And if you can show that you're an individual who's capable of that sort of iterative process of going, what's the low-hanging fruit that causes me pain, wastes time, how can I just solve that, and then take that time and invest it in solving another problem? That's the sort of thing I think that travels up the business chain, where suddenly it's like, well, this person's actually managing to affect change in the organization and how we do things, and have them be more reliable and more predictable and easier to bring on new people, and they're not necessarily having to read through a 30-step run book to do a process. They just need to understand in theory how it works and then follow the automation process. I think that's the sort of thing that becomes really appealing, not just to technical types, but to business types as well. Because ultimately that's who you're sort of justifying your existence to in a way. And I think we've just got to move away from that idea of IT and technology being the cost center and the mechanics down in the basement, when really you're kind of the enablers of what the company's actually trying to do these days. You can't do anything without technology. So I think for individuals, I'd say focus on automation, and that really means you're going to need to learn some scripting and programming skills. It doesn't mean you need to be an amazing software developer, but it means, you should be able to take a process, work out how to repeat it a few times, and throw it into a script of some kind, or throw it into a config management system like Puppet. So I really think automation is kind of the key for anyone sort of working in the system administration field. It's the thing that makes you appealing. It's the thing that startups are going to want you to have. It's the thing that large-scale shops are going to want you to have. And it's kind of fun reclaiming time out of your work week each week. I guess as far as companies go that are working at a smaller scale, I sort of say this often to people that say you've only got 2 servers. What's your disaster recovery plan if one of those dies? Is it someone's written a Word document that's like 20 pages long that's how to rebuild the server from scratch? Are you going to really accept, the 6-7 hours downtime it takes to rebuild that whole box, put it back into production, check everything by hand? The joy of using a config management system is that you're actually modeling your infrastructure and what it's meant to be doing. And if that box dies, you just build another one. And you have there are good reasons to do this even at a small scale. It's your disaster recovery. It's also how you can set up a development environment. It also lets you, say you're talking to a new server vendor who's like, I can ship you boxes that are just as fast as your other machines, and you want to actually test that. It means you can just port a workload really, really quickly, and you can be really agile in how you try out new technologies. Once you've got the whole workload defined, and say your boss goes, look, I've been reading about the cloud in this CIO magazine thing. What are we doing about the cloud? And you can sit down and go, okay, well, I've just taken our, Jira ticket system or whatever, and I've just stood up an installation on EC2. This is what it would mean. It would cost us this much a month. It would give us this sort of reliability. It would give us this sort of unreliability, because, the cloud can be kind of a hostile space too. But I think, modeling your infrastructure and understanding it is useful at a really small scale as well as at a really big scale too.
Excellent. I want to kind of pose another question that kind of goes along. How do you kind of deal with, say for instance, or how would you deal with that CTO or maybe that senior engineer that's kind of reluctant to kind of move towards configuration management? Say for instance, you've got a engineer that maybe just not a senior engineer, but just an engineer on the team that is saying, hey, this is something that we really need to look into. And you've got a CTO that might say, Yeah, that's that might be too much for us right now. That might be too time consuming. That might not be the right thing for us at this moment. How do you kind of approach that kind of reluctance?
Yeah, so I think and I don't want to turn this into a sales pitch or anything, but I work at Puppet Lab, so a lot of my stuff's going to be centered around Puppet. But it's a lot of this is true of other people's ecosystems as well, but they're totally not as good as ours. But now I've got that out there. One of the great things about Puppet and admittedly a bunch of the other config management systems is that once you define these workloads, you can do that in a really reusable way. So what we're seeing is that people don't just reuse those within their companies. We've got like the Puppet Forge, which is essentially like a marketplace for free Puppet content that other people have written, which are essentially best practices. So I think it's a really easy return on investment to show to someone who's, either hasn't been a technical person for a long time or isn't purely a business person, that you can go, look, rather than having someone sit down and install MySQL and configuring it to work just like all our other MySQL servers, I can download a single MySQL module from the Forge and with like 2 lines of Puppet code, stand it up. And the great thing about doing this is that all our MySQL servers will be configured exactly the same way. So I actually think it's a pretty lightweight sort of approach that you can take. I know part of the problem I think we have with our community is that we do have people who are doing huge, super advanced, amazing things, like at big clients like, Bank of America, or at Google, at CERN, like there are big companies doing really, really sort of sophisticated work with Puppet. But I think it's important for us to keep in mind that, I think we see about half of our users at each of our events are pretty new to Puppet. So we're trying to stay very focused on making sure things are easy to use and easy adopt. But yeah, I totally get it. Adoption friction, I think, is one of the big issues for people. And I think one of the worst situations like that is when you've got that engineer going, hey, so I really want to adopt this automation tool that'll make my whole life better. And the CTO is like, well, isn't that what I pay you for? Why does that mean I can fire you? And so I think people are kind of afraid of that sort of situation, and sysadmins don't always have all the people skills to sort of negotiate that sort of situation. But if my advice in that is always like, no, you don't get to fire me, but you get to get a whole bunch more value out of me.
I like that. I like the way you said that. Yeah. And I mean, also, for folks who are, because I know I went through this myself, wherein, when I was kind of developing in my career and I would, reach out and say, hey, I really want to do this project. What do you think? As I got older, I realized I shouldn't ever ask that. I should just start, and then I should show it to people and then ask them what they think about it. And
Absolutely.
Use that to help me kind of adjust it and improve it. Because generally, whenever you ask someone, hey, how should I invest my time? They're usually going to send you off someplace other than where you really want to go. But you really have to use your inner compass to drive you where you want to go.
Absolutely. And I think we're not servants of our companies. We're employees. And I think it's important that, we matter as people and job satisfaction matters. Of course, everyone needs to be, pushing in the same direction and making the same kind of things happen, but we've got to have scope for people to take initiative and solve problems on their own.
Yeah, I think Kelsey, when we had him on the podcast last, he kind of said it best. He said, don't ask for permission, just ask for forgiveness.
Absolutely. Every single time.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to ask for a lot of...
I was going to say, but don't get in trouble out there. We didn't tell you to get into trouble now.
But I think it's the key is, don't overinvest. If you're just trying to come up with a quick sketch that's an idea to prove to someone that something's a good idea, you don't need to go setting up 24-hour monitoring and on-call routines and backup services, and you don't even need to make it the most beautifully polished thing in the world. So long as you can demonstrate, look, this is what I got with this much investment. Look how much better it would be if you gave me more time to invest in it. I think that's kind of the path to take.
Nice. I like that.
Awesome. So I want to dig a little bit more into some of the innovative things that Puppet has done. I mean, coming from my, experiences with Salesforce, we have our own sort of proprietary language where we're able to do sort of different kinds of declarative actions against the database using our language called Apex. I understand Puppet has a language as well. I wonder, can you talk to us a little bit about that? What went into that? Were you around as that was being developed? And just what can you share around that Puppet language?
Yeah, so I think Luke Knies, who's the CEO of Puppet Labs and the original author, he did a lot of the language design, and it's survived an awfully long way. We're sort of going through at the moment sort of a major parser rewrite for the next version, so there'll be sort of a big generational change for the language. But I think it's kind of amazing how much his sort of ideas at the beginning have survived and proven to be really, really effective. So the key with Puppet is that it is declarative, and for those people who haven't sort of come across that term before, it means you're not telling Puppet how to do something, you're declaring what you want what the state should be. So rather than saying, go and change the owner of this file to be Nigel, you're saying, make sure that the owner of the file is Nigel. And so it's all state description rather than procedural script. So if you've been writing a lot of, PowerShell or Bash or whatever, and where you're used to sort of having to go, if the owner is wrong, then change the owner, or just whatever the case is, just change the owner. It's sort of a different mindset where you're building the state that you want something to be in. So not that it's the easiest language to sort of read out, I guess, over a podcast, but a really good example would be file, etc password, owner root, group root, mode, whatever the mode should be, what should be 0660, and what else would we set? That would probably be about it. You might not even manage the content. So that's like a really simple bit of Puppet. You're not telling it, go and do these things. You're just saying, look, Puppet, this is the state I want stuff to be in, and you need to go work it out yourself. And so then that becomes sort of portable across operating systems. It knows on AIX, I do it like this. On Windows, I do it like this. And on Linux or on Mac, I do it this other way. So you take that sort of ability to build up small building blocks. So we have these really atomic building blocks in Puppet that are a file, a user, a group, a package, a service, and you can combine all of those things into sort of higher level abstractions and make use of them until eventually someone can just go include MySQL, and they'll get a whole MySQL config. And inside that MySQL config might be a whole bunch of file configurations, services to restart, dependency packages that need to be specified. That could be kind of complex, but one of the joys of Puppet is as you solve problems, you can essentially take advantage of what programmers have been doing for a long time, which is encapsulation. Put a neat little interface around it, give a couple of parameters that should be tweaked, and then it becomes this powerful sort of tool in your arsenal, and you never have to go and do that particular work again. So the key with Puppet, I guess, really is that it looks pretty familiar. It looks a lot like a Nagios config file or even just a JSON blob. It's much easier to read than a programming language. It's much more like a data specification format. I mean, you've got variables and you've got a few things like that, but that's it really. And I think one of the things I found really interesting in the last 6 months is looking at what Microsoft are doing with their desired state configuration, because in many ways you can tell it was heavily, heavily inspired by Puppet. And as a small startup company still, it's pretty flattering to see Microsoft copying what you're doing.
And if you're just tuning in, you're listening to the Blacks in Technology Big Tech Talk podcast, and you just heard Nigel Kersten, CIO and VP of Operations at Puppet Labs, talking and getting meta with it about Puppet.
Excellent. I got a quick question, kind of straying from the script a little bit. So I wrote like a small pre-blog about Puppet before we had this podcast tonight, and I was talking about some of the things that kind of Puppet kind of helps with, and why you might use Puppet, and it kind of got me thinking. So with Puppet, you have of course you have your resources, and you talked about that. You have like file, user, services, things like that, and those get put together, and you put those together in the manifest, and the manifest gets compiled to a catalog. And so one of the things that kind of Puppet helps with is like image image sprawl. So if you have a bunch of systems out there, you take an image of a system and then say, for instance, something changes on a system, and then you take another image, and then something else changes. Next thing you know, you've got tons of images out there. You don't know how to manage them. You know how to keep them, keep control of them, and things like that. So, is there a such thing as manifest, or is there such thing as manifest sprawl, or because it's sort of more like a language, do you even have to worry about that?
No, I mean, I think it can be a problem. You know, all technology can turn against you as much as most tools, if they're powerful enough to do what you need them to do, can be abused in some way. But I think this is something we've been really focused on, and Puppet is trying to work out how do we remove doing it the wrong way. But there's totally a point you can get to. So I'm even thinking, when I was at Google, I remember there was a point where we had, I think, 20 different authors poking at this one Kerberos manifest file, which controlled all of the Kerberos config, which was pretty big and complicated, but we definitely made it way more complicated than it needed to be. And I think we ended up with some horrible, 800-line manifest that was completely incomprehensible, and no one understood what was going on. So it can be like code. You can end up writing code that is hard to reuse. I think it's not as bad a problem as image sprawl because we don't have anything smaller than an image in a way. Like if you're just dealing with virtual machines, you can't really easily take a snapshot of just part of it. And I think this is where, Puppet comes in. This is where Docker and containerization is probably going to change the situation a bit. But baked into Puppet pretty early, we had the concept of Puppet modules. So you divide your code up into classes and then you organize them into modules. And modules you can treat like building blocks. So it's totally possible to sit down and write really bad Puppet code for 5,000 lines that configures everything you need on one server, and then you hit another server and you're like, well, how do I reuse any of that? So it takes a little bit of effort to do that, but I guess I would argue that the adoption path I always tell people take with Puppet is pick that one small thing that is painful and irritating and needs automation and roll it out across all of your servers. Don't try and model one whole complete server and everything it does first. Instead, model one small part that's common to lots of your servers and roll it out to all of them. And then when you've done that and it's working, then you can repeat it again. And I think working in this sort of agile, incremental manner not only allows you to have smaller failures and do them more frequently and have them have less cost, but it means after you've been doing this for a couple of months, you've naturally built up your infrastructure in the form of building blocks that are recomposable in a way that images can't be.
Gotcha. That totally makes sense. Totally answers my question too. So,
yeah, and image sprawl sucks.
Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely. When we were, we actually at the company I work for, we rolled out a big cloud stack implementation. That was our first foray into public cloud offering, and we definitely ran into image sprawl. And then the way cloud stack actually does its images and things like that, we ran into a bunch of problems with it as well. So yeah. I think it's, virtualization made it easier to shoot your foot off here. Back when we were on bare metal servers, taking a snapshot was a pain in the neck. You were never going to actually do it. And the speed of provisioning was really slow. But the cloud and virtualization has now meant that it's really, really easy to just go, I'll just take an image. Let me make another 10 servers. Let me take images of all of them. And before you know it, you're just drowning in images. Yeah, exactly. So let's talk trends.
Sure.
So DevOps right now is really the big thing right now. And a lot of large-scale companies are using this methodologies and tool sets. Why has it become, I think we kind of touched on this a little bit, why has it become such a force, and what do you see as far as the future in DevOps?
Yeah, so I think, everyone, lots of people have really different definitions of DevOps, and in many ways I think it's useful to sort of just think of it as it's a signaler it's like a tribal signal for being willing to think about a different way of doing work in operations and development. So yeah. I think, lots of people have lots of different sort of ideas of what it involves, but for me, it's really, I think it's a loose collection of practices around delivering more reliable services operationally. And I think the reason it's become appealing is because we're in a different world, like 10 years ago, 8 years ago, when a new sort of way of doing things appeared amongst operations people, there wasn't necessarily the huge sort of social network in place for those ideas to, go viral and sort of spread amongst everyone. It wasn't as easy to collaborate on the internet, and it's a lot easier to collaborate these days. So I think really the big thing is that it sort of involves cultural change as well as sort of technical approaches. And I think a lot of people have known, like even if they haven't been willing to admit it to themselves, that a lot of the way we've done operations in traditional businesses is sort of fundamentally broken in how people treat each other and how communication works within the company. And so I think one of the reasons it's become such a big deal is that when people started adopting it, they started seeing real change. And without sounding like too much of an idealist, I think DevOps has kind of succeeded because these approaches work. I think that's it. It's cultural change and it's technical change, and it actually works.
Yeah, and I agree. I'm trying to think of a book that I was actually reading. I can't. It was a book about the guy was talking about like the different companies and then some of the changes that they made in order to from good to great. Yep. Yeah. So and a lot of this, things that he was talking about in the book related directly to the change in culture within the company. And also, if you read Gene, I think it's Gene Kim's book, Visible Ops. I mean, he pretty much lays that out all throughout the book. I mean, you have to change the culture and, as far as, communication, as far as how you operate as a team. If you really want to become effective and really serve your business the way you're supposed to. So.
Yeah, I think Gene deserves a lot. Like, if Visible Ops, I think, was pre-DevOps in many ways. And I'd come from an ITIL environment that, was pretty dysfunctional, and I think probably pretty much a poster child for how you shouldn't do operations, where you just filled it full of bureaucracy rather than anything else. And it was, I think Gene's sort of insight was that there are really good things in ITIL, and some of it's around rigorous process, and some of it's around loosening process and allowing sort of smaller failures. So though I think that's an amazing book, I think, Visible Ops.
Definitely. So Puppet Labs has a Puppet certification. I think when the friend I was telling you about in San Francisco, he actually went through the Puppet certification and passed it. So let me ask, and certifications has always been this thing in technology and IT as far as being able to gauge skill set and things like that. So tell us what led to the creation of the Puppet certification, and also, do we really need another industry cert? And tell us how it's
Yeah, no, that's a good one. So
and tell us how it's different from other vendor certs.
Sure. So not all certs are bad. Let me get that out there. I think there's some really good certifications out there. The reason we did it, so education and training's always sort of been a really big part of Puppet Labs. And I think even when Puppet Labs was 2 or 3 people, it was Luke, Andrew, and Teo, they were doing trainings because, and I think this is about being sort of effectiveness, and it's sort of the engineer mindset. It's like, well, I can either help 50 people within a company understand my product, or I can, train 5 of them and then they can show the others. Like it's sort of an efficiency thing. And it's a way to get the word out, and, tools can be complex, and some people like, learning about things and working out how to be more effective with it. So we've had education and training since, we've had education training since before we had Puppet Enterprise, so before we had a commercial product. So it's always been a really big part, and our pro services engineers that travel around the world, they do an awful lot of training and education. So for us, it was sort of a natural consequence to that, because we were getting a lot of companies sort of going, well, how can we want to hire someone who's been through your training, but how do we know whether or not they've been through the training or not, because you guys aren't handing out certificates? And we're having individuals go, well, look, my boss at my current job knows I've been through this training, but I'm applying for this other one and I don't have any proof. So it sort of started off as a pretty pragmatic thing. And I totally get with you. Like, the last thing the industry needs is another paper certification. And I guess to get back to the thing we were talking about at the very beginning of the podcast, employers don't rest upon looking at certifications for whether you should hire people. That should never be the determining factor. It's a really good indicator of where they've spent their time and what they've been interested in and the sort of work they might have done in the past. But you should never hire someone just because they've got a Red Hat or a Cisco or a Microsoft or a Puppet Lab certification. You should hire them because they're good people who know how to do the work you need. So I guess I'd say that it's sort of grown out of that for us. We definitely don't see it as sort of a paper certification or even particularly a money-making business for us. It's really a way to cap off and certify, no pun intended, that people sort of have a certain level of knowledge. And we really, we had overwhelming demand from it for outside the company. And I'd say it was probably 20-30% demand was coming from individuals and the rest coming from companies who are really looking to hire people. Because, we kind of have ridden a lot of this wave of DevOps and this change in mindset. And for better or for worse, in the early days of DevOps, people were definitely associating DevOps with you need to adopt configuration management. And while I'd say that config management's necessary to have sort of a great automated environment, it's not sufficient. There's a whole bunch more you have to do as well.
Gotcha. And it's good that you gave that explanation, because a lot of people, when they think about a company and they think about the vendor certification, they automatically think, oh well, they create that certification in order to make money.
Yeah,
that's kind of one of the first things. And so, just to be able to clear that up and say, hey, this is more about what we want to it's more about the learning and more about giving knowledge to people as opposed to it being a money maker for us.
Absolutely. I think if you're making lots and lots of money off your certification, something's kind of rotten in your whole structure. I mean, I'm sure before I get myself in too much of a hole with partners of ours, I'm sure Red Hat and Cisco make a bunch of money out of their certification, but I'd also say that those two, Red Hat and Cisco, I think sort of set a really great standard for practical certification. One of the things I always really admired about the Red Hat certs was you were sitting at a computer and it was running Red Hat and you were having to make it do stuff. That's awesome. I think I can't even remember I've got a Microsoft NT4 administrator certification, I think is the last cert I have from Microsoft. And from memory, that was all questions and answers. I don't think I did anything practical in that certification at all.
Yeah, and not to crap on Microsoft, but they're kind of the culprits behind the whole paper cert thing.
Yeah, but I think the industry needs to own up for being culpable about it too. If more companies were had spent time in the 90s going, well, does this person actually know what they're doing, rather than just going, NCSE, you're hired. I think it was kind of
you're right.
There was a feedback cycle that kept feeding on itself.
Definitely. I agree with you. So now you get to get into, kind of your salesman pitch here with this next question. So what are the benefits that Puppet has over other configuration management software like Chef or Ansible or CF Engine? What makes Puppet better?
So I think the strength of Puppet really comes down to that the DSL's really, really accessible. And I think we've struck a really good balance between sort of freedom and structure, because I think if you're running a config management system that essentially has a whole bunch of shell scripts underneath, it doesn't really do a great job of modeling your infrastructure. So I do think more structure around shell scripts is sort of required, rather than a system that just lives on top of shell scripts. So I think Puppet, I think we've struck a really good balance with a language that's accessible, but yet still sort of provides some structure. I think there's a bunch of other sort of things with Puppet. We have a really big ecosystem. We've got a really great sort of module forge, a bunch of those sort of secondary attributes. But I really think a lot of it comes down to the language itself is accessible and powerful enough. And, clearly not everything's perfect, and I think we're painfully conscious of our own shortcomings as well, but I think Puppet's a great product, and I think we've hit that right balance. So what's a good example? We We're really big believers in structured data. So when a Puppet node talks to a Puppet master, all of that configuration that's expressed in the Puppet language gets compiled into a catalog, as you said before. And we store those catalogs, and they're things that you can do arithmetic on them. You can analyze them. You can look at them and go, okay, well, what did my catalog look like 6 months ago? What was the actual resulting state description that was being sent to the agent? And you know that you're looking at that, and that's actually the state description that went to the agent. You're not having to necessarily run any code and evaluate it to work that out. And the same thing, I think, goes for reports. When you run Puppet, what we spit out is a structured report object, and that's an object you can ask questions of. You can go, how many failures did you have, report object? You know, how many changes? How long did you actually take? And you're not sort of resorting to scraping logs or pumping everything into Elasticsearch and Logstash to work out what's actually going on. You've got this report object, and it's pretty easy to process. We have a lot of people who write report processes and pump that information into their custom CMDB or whatever system they're actually using. They might use it for alerting. So I think the strengths of Puppet really come down to sort of an accessible language, our domain experience, and the fact that we're really big believers in structured data, which I think really helps the end users.
Gotcha. You know what I like a lot about Puppet, and not that you can't do this with other configuration management tools, but I like the fact that you guys offer this learning VM that people can just easily download, and they can get started with Puppet in no time. I've actually downloaded it quite a few times on different machines. And then I get an email from Toby Espinoza. I think that's how you pronounce it. Hey, I downloaded this. But yeah, I think that's pretty cool that you guys offer that. And then online, you guys have the tutorials that people can actually go and step through and actually pick up Puppet, some easy steps. So I think that's.
So I'm really glad to hear that you like those. And honestly, if you like those, totally watch that space, because we're doing an awful lot this year on sort of giving people more of an adventure quest. Like the old school adventures where it's like, well, first you need to go to the man next door and collect the blueberries, and then you give it to the other guy, and he'll give you a golden sword, and then you can go off and you can save the princess or whatever it is.
Nice. We're
going to be doing a lot more of that, and you're going to see a lot more sort of interesting quests and adventures in the form of tutorials.
Ah, cool. I said another great thing, and I'm hoping that Blacks in Technology and Puppet can partner up here in the future, is that it's really, how do I put this, kind of easily onboardable, if that's a word, right? So what I mean by that is people can pick Puppet up and add it to their skill set so easily, right? And how this kind of ties into the context of Blacks in Technology is that what I'm really trying to do as an organization is offer resources to improve your skill set, whether it's through the community, whether it's talking to other individuals, networking, building having this mutual improvement amongst each other, but and also closely collaborating and partnering with organizations such as Puppet Labs and some of the other organizations that we partner with recently, just to be able to provide these type of resources. And me and a friend, we were actually talking about it, and it's like, hey, Puppet, you can just easily pick it up. You can easily pick up Puppet, easily add it to your repertoire, and you right then and there, you're just that more marketable.
That's awesome. That's exactly what we're aiming for. And I think the other thing that adds, like, even just picking up the tool individually is pretty easy. But one of the things I really love about Puppet, and honestly the reason I came to Puppet Labs, was that we've got a really great community as well. And so we've got, a Stack Exchange-like site, ask.puppetlabs. We've got an IRC channel that's been super active for like 7 or 8 years now. We've got mailing lists. We have Puppet camps all over the place. We have PuppetConf, our big annual conference in San Francisco. There's a real sense of community. And, I just love the fact that I can turn up to a Puppet camp in a city I've never been to. Like, I think I'll be in Tokyo for Puppet camp on Monday. And nice. There's going to be Puppet users there who are going to want to hang out and meet up for a meal or a drink or something. And that's just awesome. I don't know. That's a pretty amazing job.
Yeah, that's great. So tell us about, you were mentioning Puppet Camp, but tell us about Puppet Conf, which is coming up in when, September?
Sure. Let me just check my dates. What have I got? September 20th to 24th. And so we've got a bunch of training and certification around there. It's in San Francisco. But we're also going to, I don't actually know for sure. We've previously every year streamed all of the conference, but you really want to get there in person as well. But I'm pretty sure we'll have at least videos up after the fact. But yeah, we've got training classes going on at PuppetConf. It's going to be awesome. Every year it's amazing.
Nice. So I'm hoping to make it out to PuppetConf this year. So we definitely have to. You like beer, so you already said that. So we definitely have to grab together and grab a beer.
That'd be great.
All right, excellent. So, last question before we get out of here. We've been going for about an hour or so. I want to ask you, if you could go back in time about 10 years, what advice would you give to yourself?
That's a pretty good question. What would I give to myself? I think what I would give myself, and this is going to sound a little bit fluffy, is that don't dismiss the business and marketing and sales side of the house as much as I did. I think I was one of those arrogant tech guys who was like, that stuff doesn't matter. What really matters is whether my Apache server's running. And I think learning to understand that side of the house and what the company's trying to do that you're supposedly in service of, that I think lets you just be more effective, have more fun at work, get given more responsibility because you're being more effective for the company. I think it would just be that, don't just dismiss those functions of the company. There wouldn't be a company without them. I'm still, I think, always going to be a technical person at heart, but there's some pretty awesome technical people in marketing divisions as well. I'd had no idea marketing was such a sort of math-based numbers game until I actually started getting involved with it as a startup. So I think there's lots of good people doing interesting work outside of technical fields at your company, and they're probably good friends to make as well.
That's good advice, because I found myself falling into that quite a bit sometimes.
Yeah, no, it's easy.
Yeah, because to me, ones and zeros is all that matters, right? And so,
That's right.
Yeah, so when, you get to the marketing and stuff, you guys don't know anything. You don't have to know what you're talking about.
That's right.
So, yeah, that's good advice. That's good advice. Ayori actually had to jump off here, so I don't think she'll be here to say thank you. But so I'll say thank you on behalf of Ayori. So I definitely want to thank you for taking the time out of your evening and joining us. I think we had a lot of fun. We answered a lot of good questions. Got a lot of good knowledge. And so I want to thank you, Nigel, for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a great conversation, and we'll keep in touch.
Definitely. And before you jump off of here, go ahead if you have any your Twitter handle or anything like that, if people are how to get in contact with you, or anything else you want to say before you jump off of here.
Sure. I'm Nigel Kersten on Twitter. I stopped using pseudonyms on the internet a little while ago, and if you follow me, you'll probably see me ranting about DevOps, cricket, and maybe the sorry state of Australian politics.
Excellent. And again, thanks for joining us, and I hope to see you at PuppetConf this year.
Cheers. That'd be great.
All right, great. Take care.
Cheers.
Blacks in Technology.
Blacks in Technology. Blacks in Technology. Blacks in Technology. Blacks in Technology. Blacks in Technology.